So right here I'm on a good sized but not humongous river. I am tossing a number 4 spinner, and I just want to go over some real basics. So whether you're fishing a pond or a lake or a river, most of these basics will still apply. So the thing about spinners is if you can cast it out and reel it in, that's all you really need to do. But there are some little things you can do to improve your game beyond that. So one is to get your spinner started, a twitch works really well to get the blade spinning. So usually right after my spinner hits the water and drops down, I like to give it a twitch to get that blade spinning, and then I continue my retrieve from there. That ensures that it starts spinning right away and I'm not blasting through a good spot with an unspinning blade. So you got your twitch. The other thing you should be aware of is feeling that blade spin. So I twitch it and I can immediately feel, as soon as I tighten up the slack after twitching, I can feel it vibrating. Now if you can see my rod tip right now, you can actually see the spinner blade vibrating. It's causing little wobbles on the tip. So if you have a nice sensitive tip or a reasonably moderate rod, you're going to be able to see the spinning of the spinner. But even better, you should be able to feel it. And that's how I judge how fast I'm going to reel in, how slow I'm going to reel in, is all based on how that spinner feels. If it starts to feel like you don't feel the spin, that's when you speed up your retrieve. And when it feels like it's spinning really fast and riding up in the water column, that's when you want to slow down your retrieve to keep it down into the strike zone. So you can control, there's a fish. Okay, so you can control your depth by how fast you reel, but you can also control it by whether your rod tip is high or low. Let's get this guy landed here. Just a little smallmouth. So for those of, So for those of you who don't have faith in the single hook, it works just fine. Nothing wrong with the single hook. It's better for the fish. Does less damage to their mouth. It's a decent little smallie. Get him back in there. Okay, so this time I'm going to cast just a little bit differently. Well, I'm going to cast the same. I'm going to do my retrieve just a little bit differently. So the far side of the river here is the deep side, and it's reasonably shallow here as it gets closer to me. So what I want to really do is I want to fish deeper on the far side, and I want to fish higher on the high side, or on this side closer to me. So I'm going to get it out there. I'm actually going to let that sink, reel in my slack, get my twitch set, start reeling. Now I'm going to drop my rod down real low here, and this is going to help drop my spinner even lower in the water. Now I'm about halfway across and things are getting shallower. I'm going to raise my rod tip up, and with the rod tip up I can actually go slower, so I can cover the ground slowly without getting hung up on stuff. So if you can see what's under the water, or if you have an idea of what's under the water because you've fished it before, you can raise that rod tip to keep the spinner high, drop it to make it drop down low, which is particularly useful if you're fishing deep holes. Alright, so now I'm going to get into a really basic amount of reading water specifically for spinner fishing. So, when spinner fishing you have options. You can cast upstream, you can cast straight ahead, you can cast downstream, or somewhere in between. A lot of times what I like to do, if I walk up to a nice open spot like this where I've got room to cast, I'm going to fan the whole thing. I actually started by casting out here just because I knew that's where I was most likely going to get some fish. But a lot of times I'll start on my left and just fan my way across. So when I cast upstream, I'm going to have to reel a lot faster to keep that from hitting bottom and getting hung up. So here, this is a pretty reasonable speed. I'm feeling bottom right there. I felt the spinner blade hit bottom twice, so I sped up. Now I'm getting to a really shallow spot here. There's a fish chasing my spinner. I can see it. Let's see. Nope, he gave up. So pretty fast retrieve. Now if I compare that to casting downstream, I can retrieve about this speed now. Quite a bit slower. So the current is going to cause that spinner to ride up on the water, which is going to make it ride higher than it would if I were casting the other way. So if you're going against the current, you can reel very slow and still stay reasonably mid to high water column. So what I like to do a lot of times is take advantage of that and not do a lot of reeling so that I can go really slow. So I'm going to show you guys my trick for that. So for this one, I'm going to cast pretty much straight out, and then I'm going to let the current swing the spinner. This is what I call stalling a spinner. I've heard a few different names for this technique, but stalling makes most sense. So once I get it going into the current, I didn't cast it far enough to the right, so I actually have to keep this reel spinning here. Also, it's summer, it's warm, the water's really low, so there's not as much current as usual, which makes stalling a bit harder. So stalling requires a fair amount of current. So really I want to get a little more diagonal down rather than straight across like that last cast. But I've got a long rod and not a huge casting space, so let's do this. Okay. So that's like a 45 or something. So now I'm right in that current. My spinner is spinning. You can see my rod tip. I can feel that. And I didn't even have to reel to get that action. So a lot of times I'll just keep that line tight and go really slow like that. Sometimes I'll just pull it with my arm really, really slow. If I feel it getting hung up on something, I'll just reel. So for stalling, really, I need to go to a spot with higher current. This spot's just really low current right now. So I'm actually going to do a more just standard style retrieve. Another thing you can do is, say I know the fish are right here. I'm going to cast over and past that somewhere up in here, so that by the time I get it tight and running, it's kind of in the strike zone. Honestly, that spot looks really fishy to me right now. There's kind of a slack water right in the middle. So I'm going to aim up and to the left of that and let it sweep down into there. See if that gets me a fish. So to summarize that, with the water flowing this way, if I cast upriver, I'm going to have to reel the fastest. If I go right tight upriver, I'm going to go really fast. If I get diagonal, I'm still going to go pretty fast. If I start to get to about here, it's going to start sweeping, and I'm not going to have to reel as fast. And then by the time it sweeps halfway through, I'll be able to do a really slow retrieve. If I go straight ahead, I'm going to do a reasonably slow retrieve right from the beginning. And if I get over into this way or farther, I'm going to slow that retrieve down even more. Whether you're fishing for pike, bass, trout, just about anything, cover like this is always a good thing to target. This little spot looks fantastic right now. I've got tree cover on this side, shade, a nice slack water cove right here that's deep, some stronger current coming in right here. This tree is blocking a lot of this current right here from this side of the island, and then there's an island over here, a big old gravel bed on the other side of the island, and then a deeper stretch throughout here. So like there's a lot of things happening here that are going to attract fish, but I'm going to focus in on these logs here, and right now I'm too close. I'm going to actually walk away, avoid this poison ivy here, and I'm going to come a little further away so that I can get a better distance cast. Should give me a little more control and better action on the retrieve. I'm just going to throw it up in there as close to that stuff as I can. See what happens. So the water's pretty slack right here, not a lot of current, other than that little bit of current that's kind of going sideways against my retrieve. So I'm just keeping a nice, really slow retrieve, keeping that spinner tight so I'm feeling it spin, but trying to go just about as slow as I can. Keep it down because I know it's a little deeper right in here. That was a bad cast. I saved it. Okay, when you're fishing a spot like this with variable currents, like I've got a little side current going here, the main current out there, I've actually got a back current over here where the water's coming back up this way, and a nice dead spot here, you're gonna change the angle of attack throughout your cast sometimes. So, I'll give you an example here. I'm gonna cast far out into that main current. Okay, I'm out there in that main current. Everything feels good. I feel my spinner spinning. It's moving down river. Now all of a sudden, I just hit bottom there. But because my current went slack, so that retrieve speed all of a sudden wasn't enough. It made it drop down. So because there's a back eddy right there, that messed the action of my spinner enough to make it drop down, and I hit bottom right there. So what I wanted to show you there is that I might start by retrieving one way and change angles completely. I'll give you another example here. Okay, here I've got my rod far to the left, which is keeping tension on the spinner so that it's working with the current. But then maybe I want to change directions so that I can bring it closer in over here. That's going to change the way the spinner spins, and I'm going to have to start spinning faster because now I'm working against the current. Fish on right away. Right away. That was cool. It's a tiny little guy. He jumped and spit the hook. So I didn't pull anything off that log, so I decided I'm gonna come over to the other side of it and fish the back side of that log, because that can be just as tasty on the back side. It creates a nice slack water that fish like to rest in. They might hide in the shade of that log. So if I can get it close to that log without getting it hung up on all this over here, it has potential. Okay, right there, my spinner stopped spinning. I had to crank on it to get that spinner spinning again. What happened was it hit a shallow patch of gravel and bottomed out and lost all of its momentum on the spin. So my options there would be either to do a twitch like we talked about before, or to just re-engage by reeling really fast. If you don't like the twitch technique, you can do the reel fast technique too. Like this, flip your bail and just crank it. That works really just as good as the twitch. I like the twitch more if I have slack in the line, because then I twitch all the slack out of the line right away and reel it up. Another good thing to do is to fish spots where you can see very clearly what's going on while you're getting used to what a spinner is doing underwater. Like I said before, you can feel that spin. So even right here, I'm feeling spin because my lure is spinning. And it doesn't take a lot. All I've got to do is keep it moving just enough to keep that spin going. What can be weird is sometimes you might feel something and wonder, is that a fish bite? So like if I come across this log or this stick right here, I'm gonna feel, oh, my blade stopped spinning, I felt resistance. It didn't feel fast and jerky, so that's not a fish. So a lot of times if you feel some weight but no head shake, that's usually sticks or weeds. And if you feel your blade stop spinning and don't know why, that could either be a fish bit and let go, or it could be you bumped into a rock, or you went too low and hit bottom or something like that. So like right here, I can see there's a rock right there. If I bumped that, my spinner would stop spinning for just a split second, and then it would re-engage and start spinning again. And the same thing just happened on that shallow gravel over there. My spinner blade ticked that gravel, and that threw off its momentum, stopped it from spinning. So you want to get used to feeling those kinds of things. Look at that, I just threw it right at a fish. It's so clear over there, I can see really well. I just had a little something. Oh, see what I mean? I felt what I believe was rocks, and then I think I hit a stick over there. Pulled some seaweed off that stick, so I can confirm that was in fact bottom and not a fish. Generally speaking, it's going to be very obvious when a fish hits your spinner. There's a good one. Even if it's a little fish, you're going to notice something very different happening. So when that happens, a little hook set is a good idea. We're going to talk a lot more about this in a different video, because I'm going to do in like part 3, I believe, everything you need to know about what reel, what rod, what line, everything to use for spinning, different ways to rig it, etc. So I don't want to go too much into that right now, but a good general rule is if your rod does this very easily, that's a good spinner fishing rod. If it's really stiff, that's not going to be a good spinner fishing rod. So what happens when a fish hits a moderate rod like this, that rod's going to bend. You can see even just pulling the line tight here causes my rod to bend. You want that for spinners, because when a fish hits, that is going to absorb a lot of the shock, but it's also going to set the hook for you so that you don't really have to do much of a hook set. And a lot of times when spinner fishing, you know, you're just reeling along, you know, nothing, and then all of a sudden, bam, it's there. You don't even really have a chance to react, you just start reeling. I usually do a lifting motion, some sort of a hook set. Definitely if you don't do a hook set at all, sometimes your fish is going to come off pretty easily. Sometimes it doesn't matter at all. It just really depends on how the fish bites it, how sharp your hook is, how good your barb is, all of that stuff. So here's an example of changing directions of your rod tip. So I'm starting to the left. I'm going to keep my rod far to the right to keep that tension and to keep my spinner running somewhat parallel to the river. But now as I get close, I'm feeling it slowing down. It's not doing quite what I wanted to. I just felt it hit bottom twice, so I'm switching directions. Now this puts a whole another level of tension on it, because now it's working against the current differently, and I'm able to slow down my retrieve, and there I just switch directions to go over that log. So you can switch directions. Let the spinner tell you when to switch directions, unless you're specifically trying to steer it towards some cover or a hole that you know has fish. When you start to feel that change and things are going slack, that's a good time to change the direction of the rod so that you don't have to reel as fast, keeping your bait in the strike zone longer and keeping you from hitting bottom and getting hung up. Another really good practice is to make sure that when your spinner hits the water that your line is already tight and that you don't have slack in the line. A couple reasons for this. One, if your line is tight when it hits the water, your spinner is going to start spinning right away as it falls. You can see you got a little spin out of that. There, it's tighter. It's hard to see here, but if you keep it tight so that the line's tight as the spinner hits the water, that spinner is going to start to drop and start to spin as it drops, and as soon as you tighten the line a little bit, it's going to kick right into gear, and you won't have to do that snap start that I was talking about earlier. So for that, we're going to cast out, and before it hits the ground, bam, I flipped that. I should have started reeling right away. The wind blew a big old bend right in my line and kind of messed that whole thing up. So that was close, but not quite. Let's try it one more time. So my goal is to flip the bail while the spinner's in the air but starting to drop, and then my goal is to be reeling as it hits the water. So let's try that again. Flip, reel, And now I can reel really slow right off the bat because it's just dropping and spinning and the current's already pulling it to the right, so I can get away with this nice, really slow retrieve. So, frequently, I'm not going to make it happen on camera because it never works that way, but many, many, many times in my life have I thrown the spinner out, kept the line tight, it hits the water, and bam, before I even reel it, there's a fish on. Fish on. Good fish. Yeah, this is a good fish. Yeah. Second it hit the water. It's swimming funny, not like a bass. Oh, it's a bass. Ooh, it's a chunker. Oh, he's got a big old shad in his mouth. Oh, man. Look at that.
Ah, that's great.
That shad. This guy's eating good. That's because that spinner spins while free falling if your line is tight. And that is why that is a really good habit to get into. Because you will pick up some extra fish that you might otherwise not get a good presentation to because you're throwing it right where they're at, but then by the time you get it spinning and in the right part of the water column, it's already moved from where they are. So if you're dropping a lure right on a tasty spot, keeping that tight line might get you an instant bite, which is always very fun. Something I forgot to mention while I was talking about learning to identify the things you feel while retrieving your spinner is blade flips. So if your spinner's in the water and it's spinning, it's going to spin pretty much in one direction. I'm failing to make that happen. So say it's spinning like this. You might hit a funky patch of current and it might stop and reverse and go the other way. Okay? And that happens. That can happen with line twist issues or just because of the way it hits the current. Sometimes slack in the line can cause that to happen. So that'll happen from time to time. What you want to get used to is noticing what that feels like and being able to tell the difference between that and hitting a rock. Because what happens when you hit a rock is essentially the same thing. Your blade stops spinning for a split second, and every time your blade stops spinning, it's almost always going to spin the opposite direction once it starts spinning again. So your blade spin will change directions back and forth depending on various factors, and that'll happen while you're reeling in also. So if you're doing that thing like I talked about where you're changing directions of your rod, sometimes you'll feel a blade flip happen when you do that. So when I first started noticing blade flips, the first thing that came to my mind is, did I just get bit by a rock bass or a bluegill or something little nipping at my spinner? Like, what is that I'm feeling? And I think for the longest time I thought I was getting bites that I wasn't getting because I was experiencing these blade flips. So, get used to that, expect that, learn what that feels like, bounce your spinners off of some rocks and some logs and things to get used to what that feels like. And again, like I said before, do it in a spot where you can see what's happening. Find an elevated spot on a sunny day with clear water and just watch your spinner and see how it reacts to hitting a rock or hitting a shallow patch or hitting a harder line of current and all of those things. The more you get used to what those things feel like, the more you'll know what's happening on the other end of the rod. And then you won't accidentally try to set the hook on non-existent fish that are really just blade flips, essentially just pulling your bait out of the strike zone for no reason. Little things like that. You'll maximize your efficiency over time by having a better understanding of what's going on the other end of the line. So right there I hit, pretty sure, some seaweed. So when I reel this in, I'm expecting to see some green stuff on my hook. The reason I think it was seaweed is because it felt heavy. Look, nothing. It felt heavy, like a fish, no head shake, and I saw a slight movement in the water of something kind of greenish when it happened. No, I don't think that was a fish at all. Learn to trust what you feel on your rod, and that's where having a sensitive rod is nice. Again, I'm going to do a whole segment on rods, so that's not really a part of this, but a sensitive rod will really help you feel what's happening. And most of the time, the rivers I fish, I can't see what's happening. Like today, I can actually see, but I've got midday sun and low water. So don't rely on your vision, rely on your ability to feel. And even with a cheap rod, you should be able to feel the action of a spinner. So you don't really necessarily need a super sensitive rod for spinner fishing, but it's definitely a bonus, because the more sensitive the rod is, the more you'll really notice the little things, and that'll help you maximize your efforts. And I'm about to maximize my efforts by fishing in a different spot, because there's nothing going on here. Oh, what was that? That was a double tap, okay? That felt like a fish. It might not have been, but the double tap very often is a fish, because you get one tap from the fish biting the line and one tap from their first head shake where the hook pops off. So you're gonna feel tap tap and then nothing. That's usually a fish. Sometimes you just hit two rocks in a row, or you hit a rock and then your blade spins funny and feels, oh, that was, I don't know. Pretty sure I hit seaweed again on that one. Yeah, it just came off. That one felt convincing though. So here I'm in a kind of a muck weed spot, and typically mucky weed spots are stuff I want to avoid unless I'm like doing something special or I really know there's something in there. But with these single hook spinners, I tend to be able to get away with it a bit. So I can see some really dense vegetation, kind of not super far out. I'm going to throw near that, not right on top of it. As long as I stay high with my rod, I should be able to stay up over most of that and still be able to fish this area fairly well. I'm mostly just fishing here because there's some shade and it feels really nice to stand in the shade. I'll put it over here and see what happens. Right on the weeds. Keep the rod tip high, reel fast. I pulled it right over all of them and then let it sink back down. And now it's in the strike zone doing what it was supposed to do the whole time. Just pulled some weeds. Just went over a log. Went through another weed patch. Just bounced off of another weed. And look, hey, it's coming in clean. I'm not going to call it weedless, but it's definitely fishable. There I hung up. Dropped right in. But I think I cleared it off. Blade seems to be spinning normally. Hit some more right there. So when you hit weeds, just give it a big twitch. Usually that'll bust all the weeds right off. Not always, but with that single hook, a lot of times it comes right off. There he is. Look at that. It's a good looking little fish too. A little stunner. It's a beautiful pumpkin seed. Really nice looking little fish. Look at the size of the spinner and the size of the fish. You can see that a little fish will hit a pretty good sized spinner. That's a number 4 from Steelhead Slammers. Number 4 Steelhead Slammers. It's about the same size as a number 4 Meps.